I never knew what it meant to truly live until I turned 61. The thought hit me like a wave. Had John held me back all these years? Or had I been the one denying myself? The questions stirred inside me, part regret, part revelation. Thomas didn't say a word. He just watched me, as if he already knew the answer. And that gave me courage. He supported me, not with his hands, but with his eyes, as my fingers slowly grabbed the straps and pulled them down. "Oh, hi there. Didn't see you there. I was just telling a little story about what we went through. Let me start over so you can get the full picture of how it all unfolded." I was 61 years old, and honestly, I never thought something as innocent as cleaning up would lead to this, all thanks to my step-grandson suddenly showing up. It had been 8 years since my husband John passed away, leaving me feeling lonely and widowed for far too long. It was late morning when I finally decided to tackle the one thing I'd been putting off for years, cleaning out the basement, that chaotic little corner of the house that I avoided every time it crossed my mind, the thought of it tightening my chest. But I'd gathered the courage to face it, that dusty room full of old boxes, musty-smelling junk, and memories of a lifetime. The first box I opened revealed something that caught me completely off guard, an old photo album from my younger days. As I flipped through it, one particular photo stood out. It was from a beach party. There I was, holding a margarita in one hand, wearing a bright orange bikini, laughing like I didn't have a care in the world. A carefree young Elizabeth, beaming with joy, stared back at me. Looking at that photo stirred something inside me. It was a mix of warmth and sadness. Memories I'd buried long ago, desires and excitement I'd suppressed, all came rushing back. And just then, I heard a sound coming from the basement door. Startled, I turned around to see Thomas, my step-grandson, standing there. I hadn't seen him in 4 years. He looked broader now, more grown up, with that familiar smile of his. The last time I saw him, he was 20. Now he must have been 23. "Thomas, surprise," he said, lifting a coffee cup in the air. "Elizabeth, Thomas, when did you get here?" I asked, caught off guard, but genuinely happy to see him. "Thomas, just now. Saw your car outside and figured I'd come in. Looks like you could use some help." I was about to say, "No, I've got this." But before I could, he'd already walked over, a determined look on his face for someone so young. His eyes landed on the album I was holding. Thomas approached Elizabeth, his gaze fixed on the photo album. "What's this?" he asked, before I could snatch the photo out of his hand. I froze for a moment. His eyes were locked on that picture of young Elizabeth on the beach. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity before turning to me. Is this you?" he asked. "Well, yeah," Elizabeth said with a nervous laugh. "My wild years back in the day." Thomas's gaze shifted from the photo back to me. There was something in his eyes, a mix of admiration and surprise. Thomas continued to examine the photo, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Wow, it's weird to think of you like this, but impressive," he said, smiling. "If you're enjoying these little confessions, join me on my channel for more. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications because, trust me, this story is just getting started, and it's one you won't want to miss." I felt a flicker of something inside me, something I couldn't quite understand. Feelings I had buried for years, emotions John had never truly awakened in me. They surfaced for just a moment, but this wasn't right. It couldn't be. "All right, enough with the trip down memory lane," I said quickly, closing the album. "We've got to start hauling these old boxes out of here." But I had no idea where that photo, Thomas's expressions, and this storm brewing inside me were going to take me. "We really need to look at this," he said, half joking, half serious. "It's unbelievable seeing you so young, vibrant and different. Come on, let's look a little more." I hesitated for a moment. Not all the pictures in that album were innocent. Beyond those carefree beach snapshots, there were bolder photos, moments that captured the wilder side of my youth. But seeing how fascinated Thomas was, and feeling the admiration in his eyes, I couldn't say no. "All right," I said with a small smile, "but some of these photos might be a bit much." "I'm sure everything's great," he said, taking the album into his lap. As he sat down beside me, his breath was close enough to brush my skin. As we flipped through the pages, the beach party photos gave way to snapshots of my college years in nightclubs. One photo showed me in a tight, backless red dress, dancing tipsily. Thomas lingered on that one, staring at it a little too long. "This is really you?" he asked, his eyes darting between the photo and me, his face lighting up with a mix of awe and curiosity. "Yeah," I replied a little bashfully. "It was just youth, you know. Things were different back then." Thomas was silent for a moment before finally saying, "You're incredible." He paused and then added, "All this time I've only ever thought of you as my grandmother. But you were like a total, I don't know, party girl." His words made me blush, but at the same time they stirred something inside me. I thought about how John had never shown me that kind of admiration. Even when I was younger, he'd always been distant, cold and strict. But Thomas, he was different. The look in his eyes told me more than his words ever could. As we kept flipping through the album, the photos got bolder. There was one of me laughing with friends, wearing a short pair of shorts and a bikini top. Another showed me dancing in a nightclub in a plunging black dress. It's a privilege to see these. Even when you were younger, your beauty was breathtaking. John was one lucky man. His words warmed me, but they also made me feel something else, something strange. The more I felt Thomas's attention, his interest, the more I realized there was a pull between us. He was like the kind of man I had dreamed of when I was younger, confident, openly admiring, and eager to discover the parts of me I'd kept hidden. When we reached the last page, Thomas closed the album, but didn't move his eyes from me. "Elizabeth," he said in a low voice, "you're truly extraordinary." I was surprised and moved by his words. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me that way or said things like that to me. As my eyes locked with Thomas's, I felt the air between us grow heavier. Something was shifting. Despite the cold, dusty atmosphere of the basement, a warmth rose inside me. Thomas's presence was making me feel young again. At the same time, I had no idea where these feelings were taking me. When Thomas closed the album and turned to me, there was still that deep admiration in his eyes. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low but completely sincere. "After seeing all those pictures, I have to say this. You haven't aged a day. You still look young and absolutely beautiful." The compliment took my breath away for a moment. Even in my youth, I wasn't used to hearing words like that, especially not from John. My heart beat a little faster, and I felt a slight warmth creeping into my cheeks. "Thank you, Thomas," I said. "But there's no hiding the fact that I've aged." Still, I paused for a moment, gathering my courage before continuing. "Maybe I've gotten older, but I haven't lost touch with my desires. I've never let go of them." Thomas smiled, his green eyes locked on mine, unwavering. "I can feel that. You're not just beautiful, you're absolutely captivating." I couldn't help but let my eyes wander over his broad, athletic frame for a moment. His tall stature, wide shoulders and slightly curled blonde hair gave him the air of a movie star. But what struck me the most was the confident, yet gentle expression in his green eyes. "It's interesting hearing something like that from someone like you," I said. Smiling faintly, I added, "John was nothing like you. He was always so calm, so distant. He never did anything to truly surprise or excite me. He was a good man, but—" Thomas tilted his head, listening intently. "But not the kind of man you desired, right?" he asked. I thought about looking away, but couldn't. "Yeah," I said honestly. "John was never as exciting or passionate as I wished he could be. I'm not saying he was a bad man, but I always felt like something was missing." Thomas was quiet for a moment before giving me a gentle yet confident smile. "Maybe it's important you realize that," he said. "Maybe now's the time to figure out what fills that void." His words lit a spark inside me. The way this young man was showing interest in me, understanding me, and speaking so confidently, it stirred an excitement I hadn't felt in years. In that moment, I realized Thomas wasn't just different from John. He was also incredibly close to the kind of man I used to dream about in my youth. But I didn't know where these feelings would take me, or if they were even the right direction to go in. After a pause, Thomas stood up and slid his hands into his pockets. His green eyes settled on me again. "I'm going to put the bike in the garage and come right back," he said with a steady voice. "But don't stay in the basement, Elizabeth. Wait for me in the living room, all right?" The confidence in his tone and the way he took charge left an unusual effect on me. I nodded slightly, agreeing. "All right, Thomas," I said. Thomas walked upstairs with quick steps, and as I watched him go, I found myself thinking about how even his love for his motorcycle was affecting me. I imagined how he might look while working on it or riding it. Energetic, passionate, determined. Exactly the kind of man I used to dream about when I was younger. "He's so much like the person I always imagined," I murmured to myself. "But he's my step-grandson. And yet right now, he's really having an effect on me." I moved to the living room and waited. It wasn't long before Thomas returned holding a bottle of wine. The moment my eyes landed on the label, I recognized it immediately. It was my favorite wine, Rose. I had no idea how he knew or why he thought of it, but once again, I felt a spark ignite inside me. "I got this from the best place I could find," he said with a slight smile. "I hope you like it." "Like it?" I said, surprised. "Thomas, this is my favorite wine. How did you know that?" "I noticed little things when I was younger. I guess I remembered right." I paused for a moment. The fact that this young man had remembered so much about me was deeply touching. "Thomas," I said softly, "this wine is really special and so thoughtful. Thank you." He opened the bottle, poured it into 2 glasses and handed one to me. "Then let's share some good memories tonight, Elizabeth," he said. I raised my glass and we toasted. As I took the first sip, the unique taste of the rose danced on my tongue, and I couldn't help but keep my eyes on Thomas. As the conversation flowed, I found myself drawn to him, not just for how he looked, but also for the way he thought and carried himself. At one point, when our glasses were nearly empty, Thomas's eyes locked onto mine once again. There was a warmth in his gaze, a pull I couldn't ignore. Inside me, I felt something shifting, a mix of fear and excitement, but I still had no idea where these feelings were leading me. Suddenly, Thomas paused. He set his glass down on the table and turned his eyes back to me. This time his gaze was more determined, more intense. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low, but filled with emotion he couldn't hide. I looked at him and realized my breathing had quickened. My heart was pounding in my chest. "Yes, Thomas," I whispered, my voice barely audible, as if it couldn't manage more. In that moment, Thomas reached for my hand. The warmth of his fingers moving gently over my delicate, slender hand sent a rush of emotions through me. "I know I shouldn't say this," but he began. "When I look at you, I just can't stop myself. You're not just incredibly beautiful, you're so much more than I ever imagined." His words echoed somewhere deep inside me, and I felt my face flush. "Thomas, you," I started, but before I could finish, he hesitated for just a moment before leaning in. At that moment, my heart felt like it was about to stop. Watching him move closer, I knew I should say no, but I couldn't fight the powerful pull I felt toward him. When his lips touched mine, slow and deliberate, the world seemed to pause for an instant. That kiss. It was gentle but also deep. I felt desires I'd suppressed for years suddenly come flooding back. As his strong hands moved to my waist, I let myself fully surrender to the moment. When Thomas's lips pulled away from mine, I could feel the tension between us lingering in the air. My heart was still pounding like crazy. I looked at him, hoping my eyes could somehow express what I was feeling, but putting those emotions into words seemed impossible. In that moment, driven by an impulse I couldn't ignore, I leaned in and kissed him again. This time it was me making the move. As my lips pressed against his once more, something inside me felt alive again.